Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming to this is the third of our talks in the Keswick Hall Lecture series on faith and British politics. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce our speaker this evening, who many of you in this room will be very familiar with, but for the benefit of the live streaming, it's necessary to just do proper introductions to Right Honourable Charles Clarke, who was, of course, MP here in Norwich South from 1997 through to 2010. During that period, he held two of the key offices of state, as Education Secretary and also as Home Secretary. He lost his seat in 2010, which maybe the city's loss was the university's gain, because he came here and was appointed to a position as visiting professor within the School of Politics, or Political, Social and International Studies as was at the time. It's now the School of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication Studies. And during that period of time, Charles has been a tremendous asset to the school in terms of his teaching with, and his input in terms of various research initiatives that the school has taken. He's been quite prolific in writing as well during this period of time. And off the back of an extremely popular and well-received series, The Too Difficult Box, which basically enabled government ministers and civil servants to reflect on those issues which get kicked into the long grass, all those difficult issues. Should we renew Trident? Should we... how do we deal with people in their old age? All those really tricky issues. And on the back of that, a book came out called The Too Difficult Box, which actually won the prize for the best practical politics book last year. He's also produced another two books on Labour Party leaders and Conservative Party leaders as well, which are receiving significant acclaim. Now, he'll obviously speak to you about the subject tonight in the context of sort of faith and British politics. In addition to his role here at the University of East Anglia, Charles has also been heavily involved with the Westminster Faith Talks put on by the University of Lancaster in London, and has had a real active engagement in terms of faith and the role of faith within this country today. So he comes at this with quite a lot of thought and a significant amount of input in terms of the debates which have taken place in London. And we're particularly pleased to welcome him here tonight for this, the third lecture. Charles Clarke.
Well, Lee, thank you very, very much for that characteristically, typically generous and warm introduction. I very much appreciate it. And I want to begin by very much welcoming this set of Keswick Hall lectures, of which, as Lee said, this is the third. I intend to focus this evening on the overall relationship between politics and faith, which I believe to be a much more important relation than many people appreciate. It's a factor, often a highly significant factor, in current politics and diplomacy, both internationally and domestically. And I think it needs more debate, more consideration, more understanding. From the rise of the so-called religious right in the United States to the importance of religious and ethnic divisions in the Arab world and intercommunal tensions in the Western Balkans or the Indian subcontinent, the specifics of faith have a major impact upon politics and international relations. In the UK, no serious assessment of education policy, community development, social care, scientific and technological change in health, counter-terrorism, constitutional reform is complete without serious consideration of the relationships between faith and politics. However, this relationship, in my opinion, is all too often characterized by misunderstandings and misrepresentations. Malevolence and disrespect are commonplace, even amongst intelligent commentators whom one would expect to be better informed. For example, I remember very well at the time of the visit to this country by the Pope in September 2010, some of the attacks on the Catholic Church by so-called rational humanists were ill-informed and intemperate. Much discussion of Islam is similarly unbalanced, including even from the Prime Minister and other senior politicians. Some contributions, for example, to debate about the existence of faith schools betray almost no understanding of the ways in which such schools work and peddle images which are both colourful and often utterly misleading. What I find distressing about the conduct and language of some of those who, like myself, cannot bring themselves to believe in the existence of God is the contempt they so often express towards those who do have faith and the ways in which they seem to consider almost every act of believers as motivated by malevolence, evangelistic ambition, or self-interest. And too often, their condemnation is larded with self-satisfied arrogance and condescension. During my political life, I've come across an enormous range of individuals for whom faith has been an immensely important positive motivator, sometimes an absolutely essential support in times of difficulty. They do not deserve, in my opinion, to be maligned and challenged in the way that they often are, or to have their own conduct and beliefs confused with those of the sectarians, extremists and obsessives who certainly do exist within every faith, as amongst those of no faith. Humanists and atheists would rightly, absolutely rightly, deny that philosophical beliefs such as theirs led inevitably to the secular totalitarianism of Stalin, Hitler or Pol Pot. They should not make the similar charge that adherence to a faith leads inevitably to the Inquisition or religious intolerance of other forms. And it's worth remembering that the secular nature of modern France, for example, flows directly from its own history in the anti-clerical nature of the 1789 revolution, when the church, including the divine right of kings, was a central part of the apparatus of power which the revolution was intended to overthrow. In contrast, today, the church often plays a quite different role in many parts of the world. It certainly cannot be assumed that faiths of any variety are natural or inevitable collaborators in the exercise of state power, as was the case at the time of Louis XVI. Indeed, in many countries, faith is often the means by which those who wish to challenge oppressive power retain the ability and confidence to do so. I make these introductory, rather strongly worded, I know, remarks to try and explain why I believe this issue is so important, why it's important to get a more temperate debate about it, and to set a background to the central points which I intend to make. I'm going today to set out my own views on the ways in which this relationship between faith and society should be addressed in the United Kingdom. I'm not going to address the international issues, which are immense, and will leave that until another occasion. The truth is that faith has always been difficult to discuss, perhaps particularly on the left of British politics, from whence I came. Influenced as the left has been, both by Tawney's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, a very important work, and Karl Marx's observation that, quotes, religion is the opiate of the masses. However, I think the left ought to be more sympathetic to at least the practice of faith, if not the theology, than it often is. And I should emphasise I speak as an individual who's not a theist and has never belonged to any faith community. We need to start with a number of statements, 4 of them, which ought to be obvious and widely accepted, but in my opinion are not. First and foremost, faith is generally a force for good. The values of all of the main faiths of the world promote love and understanding, respect and hope, care by the strong for the weak, societies based upon justice rather than unfairness, coexistence in peace and harmony. In general, they abhor and attack evil, cruelty and hatred. For these reasons, it should be no surprise to find that throughout this country, people of faith are to be found prominently and actively involved in the voluntary community and charitable organisations which promote education, social care of a wide variety of different types, and seek to build community strength and awareness. That's certainly the case here in Norfolk, which has a very strong range of voluntary and community organisations which play a very important role. I was personally brought to this realisation when I worked at the end of the 1970s in the London Borough of Hackney. My role was to encourage and stimulate community organisation in Hackney. And you found that just about every organisation that was playing a positive and important role in the Hackney community, a very deprived inner city community, was motivated and driven by people of very active faith. A whole variety of very different faiths, by the way. Some Christian, a whole set of varieties of Christianity, some Jewish, some Islam, some Hindu, Buddhists, a whole range of different forces. But of the vast range, and there were very many community organisations in Hackney which were trying to improve the lives of the people of the community and trying to strengthen the community, the overwhelming majority were led or motivated, organised by people who had a particular faith rather than people who didn't. The organisations, to give another example, which seek to build an ethical approach to foreign policy, for example, in world trade and development, or disarmament, or in relationship to particular conflicts, are often greatly populated by individuals who are also members of faith communities. And in my experience, as I say, it's positively unusual to examine any of the enormous range of charitable and voluntary organisations which are so essential for our communities without seeing the active engagement of people of a range of faiths. And equally important, it's very important to appreciate these people who do this important work and who contribute to society in this way are not doing so as part of a sinister recruitment campaign to draw people to their own particular sectarian set of beliefs. They do so because it's part of their own mission, their own assessment of the contribution they can make to fulfill the values by which they themselves have chosen to live. And that's how they live their lives, is to contribute in those ways. And I believe that the overwhelming volume of interrelationships between faith groups and the wider community are of this type, supportive and giving for reasons of faith and belief. My second general point, which I think we ought to be clear about and to assert, is that the general practice of faiths is to respect other faiths and to foster good relations and tolerance between them, the general practice of faiths. There are a multitude of examples of interfaith organisations which are founded upon fostering that respect and promoting understanding. These are international, national and local. And where such local organisations exist, the community is stronger for it. Just to give one very personal example, after the appalling attacks of July the 7th, 2005, when I was Home Secretary, there were real worries about the possibility of interracial conflict in parts of the country responding to those bomb explosions. And so I brought together the leaders of a wide range of different faith communities that afternoon of that same day, July the 7th, to make a statement themselves of the importance of respect and confidence in other faiths and to try and discourage any kind of vindictive responses from anybody in this situation. And of course they all did so, as was always certain that they would, positively, enthusiastically from the very beginning. And one of the consequences was that the response in most parts of the country to these attacks was robust and positive, largely because, in fact, strong relationships had been built up over years by different faiths in a wide range of different communities. The existence of intercommunal tensions has usually been a sign of failure to build such local cooperation, in contrast to those areas which have achieved good and effective joint working relations based on mutual respect. It's certainly true, and I'll come back to this in a second a bit more, that some parts of some faiths can be inward-looking and self-absorbed. But I think in general, such tendencies are on the retreat rather than on the advance. It's increasingly difficult to remain isolated and separatist in a modern world where intercommunication is so central to the experience of everyone. My third point is that in Britain, faith communities very much reflect the overall values of the whole society of which they're a part. Every faith broadly accepts the profound set of values which have been achieved over centuries and are at the core of British society, including adherence to democracy as a means of governing ourselves and of bringing about change in our society, support for the values of freedom of belief, worship and expression, including a free economy and free media, support for a society based on tolerance of others and acceptance that Britain is a country in which people of many faiths live side by side in peace and harmony, support for the rule of law expressed through the British criminal justice system in both principle and practice, and even though this has been very controversial in some faiths, support for the position of women as full citizens with the right to participate fully in society and to make their own choices about their own lives. Though there are parts of all faith communities which contest some aspects of these values, in my opinion it's wrong to suggest that significant parts of any of the British faith communities contest them fundamentally. And of course, just as an aside, in light of some of the debate that takes place, it's worth observing that the people who've migrated to this country have done so precisely because they wanted to become part of this society with these values. That's one of the reasons why people have come to live here from around the world. Of course, each of those values that I've described has evolved over time in this country, and some of them have been hotly contested. For example, the steady improvement over decades of the position of women, involving as it does issues such as the legalisation of abortion and the wide availability of contraception, has been controversial, including for some of the main faiths. That's also true for changes in legislation about sexual relations, such as the formalisation of civil partnerships and the gay marriage, which are also controversial. The controversy within the Church of England about women bishops is another example of the controversy in this field. And on the wider policy front, there have been deeply held concerns in some faiths about wider ethical and moral questions, such as stem cell research, or we saw in the vote in the House of Commons yesterday, Sunday trading, where the Church played a significant role in trying to oppose the changes which the government was proposing. And of course there have been concerns from some faiths about particular aspects of British foreign policy. But in general in Britain, those faiths have made their case entirely within the democratic framework, and rightly so. We have not experienced the kinds of anti-democratic destruction which, for example, some American groups have used to wage war on abortion clinics, just to give one example. And of course there are more dramatic examples in other spheres. Even for those terrible political conflicts which many fear are caused by context between faiths, I would argue that it is not always easy to disentangle cause and effect. In Northern Ireland, for example, was the conflict since 1968 caused by dispute between the faiths, or is it not more true that social, economic and political discord have been promoted by those who abuse the label of faith based upon the historical circumstances of an entirely different era? Is even the Middle East conflict driven by competition between faiths, or is it not more accurate to describe its causes in a range of geopolitical tensions, again exacerbated by abuse of faith, often on the basis of historical assertions which may well be misleading or even entirely false? It's necessary to address such questions because so many people make the direct assertion, which I believe needs to be challenged, that it is interfaith hostility and conflict which bears the main responsibility for fighting in terrorism in many different examples and fields throughout the world. And I simply think that's not an accurate description of what is actually going on in terms of cause and effect. My fourth central point is that all faiths have within them groups which are sectarian, extremist and potentially destructive. As I indicated earlier, all faiths contain within them sects which behave and try in an inward-looking way and tend to isolate themselves, sometimes with extreme examples of separation from the wider society and others, from their faith community. But sometimes this separation and isolation can lead to the formation of more serious and potentially destructive groups. The range of examples is legion, extending from groups which are cultish in character around the focus of one leader or guru. I think of Jim Jones and the People's Temple in Guyana, for example, to groups which are nihilist and ready to destroy in the most cynical way, such as the Aum Shinrikyo group, which attacked the Tokyo Tube with sarin in March 1995. To those who are principally motivated by particular political conflicts and use faith as a cover, either cynically or genuinely, for their political motivations. Such groups are ready to use the most destructive means to achieve their ambitions, to recruit and draft naive volunteers to follow that banner, and so to be used to destroy and be destroyed. Al-Qaeda, ISIL and their related family of associated organisations is the main example in the world today of such a group, though there are many others. However, I return to my central point. The existence of such sects and groups and the danger posed by them does not, in my opinion, justify the argument that faith is a force for evil. Their existence, these groups' existence, means that their motivations and actions need to be disentangled from the beliefs, values and practice of the main faith communities. The failure to disentangle such actions from the general religious beliefs makes it far more difficult to contest them, and those who try and bring together an overall range of religious beliefs together with the action of these extremist and fundamentalist subgroups of the faith are sometimes deliberately, but in any case, in effect, generally, making it more difficult to find ways of dealing with the genuine threat which the groups, where the violent groups, do represent. So my four main positions, just to recapitulate them, that I put forward for your consideration. First, that religion is a force for good, generally speaking. Second, that in practice, religions respect other faiths in general. Third, that the religions in this country reflect the overall values of society in their own behaviour and conduct. And fourth, within each faith, there are sectarian and divisive elements. I think are the thoughts that should characterise the way in which we approach these issues in this relationship between faith and society. If this set of four arguments about the relationship of faith to society is broadly accepted, it seems to me that a number of practical conclusions follow. And that's what I now intend to address. First, the state ought to do what it can to bolster the strength of the mainstream faiths which promote good and accept the values of our society. This is rather like establishing a faith by giving it a particular status and law in government practice. This is already done in a variety of ways by many countries throughout the world, including a number of Muslim countries. In some countries, for example, they're ministers for religious affairs who are directly involved in faith matters, including appointment of faith leaders, a more extreme case than anything we have in this country. Part of the reason for this is to encourage by all means the possible mutual respect between different faiths. In this country, it's already strong in most parts of the country, but it could still be strengthened further. Perhaps a useful step would be to understand better where mutual respect is strong and where it's weak, and what measures can help to strengthen it. When I think of this, I think of the chain of towns across the Pennines from Lancashire to Yorkshire, where you've had a whole series of quite different experiences, from excellent inter-community relationships in some towns to violence, demonstrations and so on in other towns. The rise of the used to be the National Front, then the British National Party and so on, has taken place in some towns but not others. And I think it's a direct result of the fact in some of those communities serious efforts were made to work together and build strong, coherent communities. In other areas, they weren't. And that needs to be understood and examined in a greater deal of ways. The historic conflict between church and state, which led to the establishment of a Church of England which owed allegiance to the British head of state, was followed over a considerable period of time by accommodations to the British system with the Roman Catholic Church, though again a very checkered history, and then by Judaism, which in both cases have become in a sense part of the established British political system. The same is increasingly true of the other faiths, though the less hierarchical structures of some of those can make the means of expressing this more difficult to achieve. I do think the state ought to encourage a stronger formal relationship with the main faith communities. For example, we should make it unequivocally clear that it's perfectly appropriate for faith-led voluntary and community organisations to receive public support on the same basis as those which are not faith-led for their charitable and voluntary work. Similarly, the state should consider offering financial support to the education and training of faith leaders, provided that they abide by the commitment to accept values of the type which I've set out above. It's particularly important to analyse where the local cooperation between faith communities is strong and where it's weak. And in the weaker areas, the churches, supported where appropriate by the state, should promote and encourage such local cooperation on the model of the best areas. At a more constitutional and legal level, I think there's a strong case for giving non-Church of England faiths an explicit role in the legislature. We've got 26 Church of England bishops in the legislature at the moment, and occasionally the chief rabbi is a member of the House of Lords. The Catholic faith is not represented in the House of Lords, other faiths on a very, very partial and occasional basis, and I think a systematic set of relationships would be appropriate there. Another example where a change in the law would, in my opinion, be beneficial is the legal requirement that the act of collective worship in school should be predominantly Christian. This was established only in 1988, when the House of Lords defeated Margaret Thatcher's government extraordinarily by making this a legal requirement. I recommend anyone interested in the subject to read the Hansard Lords debates of the time, which I did over one Christmas when I was Education Secretary, which display attitudes which I think would now be seen as completely unacceptable in this country, as a group of backbench peers got past the then government of the day a set of proposals and a wording for the act of collective worship, which is seriously weakening in a wide variety of different ways. It's time to change that legal specification and to permit teachers and governors to determine for their own school the best way to use that time to promote understanding of faith and values and morality more generally. These are only some examples, and of course there are many more. The second conclusion I draw is that by the same token the state should do whatever it can to challenge those forces within the faith which seek to undermine their commitment to the values of society which I set out above. I don't think the fundamentalists that I've mentioned should be allowed to go unchallenged. Changes have already been made, for example, to outlaw the preaching and incitement of hatred on the basis of religious belief. I'm very careful in the presence of Alex as to what I say, who's the principal researcher in the country on this matter and has compared with what's going on in many different areas. But the purpose of that is to outlaw the incitement of hatred, which is what some people try and do in those areas. Steps have already been taken where possible to remove from the country those preachers who promote such hatred. And I think steps should be taken further, if necessary, to make sure the preaching of hatred is not permitted. I think that religious leaders who are not UK nationals should not be allowed to enter the country to preach unless they can demonstrate their readiness to accept the fundamental values of our society as I set out above. It's not only a question of language, but is a matter of philosophy and belief. In short, we need to draw more explicitly the dividing line between the mainstream faiths, which are a tremendously important part of our national life and should be embraced wholeheartedly as such, and the sects who use faith as a means of promoting their often destructive politics. The confusion is dangerous both to our wider society and to the mainstream faiths themselves, and it needs to be rigorously exposed. My third point is that it's necessary to recognise that we now live in a media goldfish bowl in which it's all too easy to use a variety of provocations to undermine the open-mindedness and respect which are fundamental to our society. We all need, consciously and positively, to promote tolerance and to eschew provocation, particularly the competitive provocations which can so easily be whipped up and which are so damaging. There are many examples of this. Some years ago, the Danish cartoons published by the Jyllands-Posten newspaper were a deliberate irritant to Islam and succeeded in their provocation. The paper had the right to publish the cartoons. In a free speech society, that has to be the case. But I don't think that it showed good judgment in doing so. The British media, perhaps surprisingly to some, certainly to me, exercised its freedom not to provoke and didn't publish the cartoons, and I think was right to behave in that way. Of course, by the same token, the response of some Muslim groups to the cartoons was utterly unacceptable and was in turn designed to provoke the reactions which they sought. The most recent example, which is so graphic for all of us so recently, the Charlie Hebdo atrocity in January last year, where a Charlie Hebdo provocation was responded by a set of appalling murders, which were completely unacceptable, of course, and illustrated this point that provocation leads to response. And there's a process that goes on, so people have to judge whether they provoke or not. There are other controversies, for example, over clothing and jewellery, for example, wearing the veil or the crucifix, which have stimulated similar storms, all kinds of legal and other conflicts. The principles behind these matters seem to me pretty simple to state. Every individual should, in their regular day-to-day lives, have the right to wear whatever they like. But as they choose what to wear, they should understand that their choice will send a message to others upon which judgments will be formed. That's been true throughout the ages and applies to a pierced lip, a tattoo or a punk hairstyle, just as much as it does to a veil, a dog collar or a white poppy. However, in many working in other environments, uniforms are worn. This is usually for good reason, and the rules for uniform need to be enforced with fairness and sensitivity. Most uniforms, for example in school or at court, will not be able to include the wearing of the veil, as it inhibits essential facial communication so greatly. But the point I emphasise is that these matters in practice can be resolved by a tolerant and balanced approach. There are many examples I could give of head teachers who've been able to sort out particular problems just by applying good sense to address it in a particular way. These issues are routinely sorted out with goodwill and common sense. They're not really great matters of philosophical concern, which some try and make them, and they shouldn't be treated as such or given such great attention in the media. Building respect in our society means more common sense and less grandstanding from everyone. The media, politicians, faith leaders have a particular responsibility to behave with restraint and moderation in defence of the traditional tolerant values of our society and in marshalling those who seek to provoke in order to further their own sectarian ambitions. The fourth conclusion I draw is that we all need to put identity in its right place. The idea of identity is fundamental. It's taken on a much greater significance with the development of a global society. The enormous movements of people, the growth of world media, the weakening of traditional nation-state in some contexts means that identity becomes still more important. And of course, terrorism has brought people's fears to a new level and helped open the way to far-right neo-fascist parties in Europe, all of them based on what I consider to be a backward-looking and inverted version of identity. It's very difficult to see the best way through here, but I think Professor Amartya Sen's outstanding book, Identity and Violence, sets out a full analysis of the complex web of identities which each of us possess. I won't here simply rehash his analysis, though I strongly commend the book, but I do want to emphasise what seemed to me his main argument. He starts from the obvious point that every individual, every person in this lecture theatre, has a vast range of identities. For example, gender and sexuality, race, faith, parental background, profession, occupation, residency, age, and so on. Faith is one of the identities on this list, but only one, and for relatively few people is it the most important. For some it is, but not for so very many. From that, it flows that each individual's for themselves should be able to make a choice between these identities and to decide how much weight to give them in their own lives. And each individual has to be able to do so freely. That's to say, each individual has to decide how much they're a man, how much they're a white Briton, how much they're Church of England, how much they're an upper middle class toff, whatever it might be, fits into their definition of themselves and how they decide to live their lives. And that might mean they want to give total dominance to one particular aspect of their identity, but it might mean they want to suppress that particular aspect of their identity and not really live it through in any particularly significant way for them. All of us should be encouraged and enabled to make those decisions for ourselves, and we should not be categorized in our whole lives by only one or perhaps two of our identities, for example, predominantly by our race or faith. So when people are called Pakis, for the sake of argument, that for me is a completely unacceptable definition by putting all the identities of a particular individual under one label. At a more ridiculous level, one could say that Ipswich supporters should be allowed to be considered not only as Ipswich supporters when there is Norfolk, but as people who have a variety of different identities, of which one is supporting Ipswich. But that can't be the only thing which defines who they are. So each individual should be able to make those decisions for themselves, and each individual should not be categorized by others. Of course, it becomes very serious when it's the media or political parties trying to categorize whole communities in a particular way, when in fact those communities are made up of a large number of different individuals expressing the identities which are reflected in their community in a variety of different ways. Those who try and categorize people in that way are usually wrong, and sometimes dangerously wrong. And so we should not classify, in the context of this conversation, all faith communities as having the same motivations, because they do not. This analysis highlights the freedom of the individual to choose his or her own priority of identities. So, for example, a woman must not be required to behave in a certain way only because the heads of the religion into which she was born so decree it. The woman must decide for herself how she decides to behave in her own circumstances. So my argument is that as we address the place of identity in the modern world, we all need to accept that it's usual for people to have a range of identities, to accept that individuals must be able to prioritize their own identities in accordance with their own lives, and that no one should categorize you by just one of your identities alone, such as faith or race. And I believe that wide acceptance of these principles in practice would greatly assist public debate on these matters. Fifth, I turn to the central role of education in promoting these values. For me, the central issue is what is actually taught in schools and colleges, and what is the experience of young people. It's impossible to study subjects such as history, geography, philosophy, sociology, citizenship, languages, including English, and of course religious education, without addressing the place of faith. Faith is an element of all of those subjects, of course, inevitably so. But a central concern is the way in which faith is dealt with in the curriculum. Even basic knowledge and understanding of all faiths is sometimes lacking, even amongst some teachers. That's why I was proud that we were able to establish, when I was Education Secretary, a non-statutory framework for religious education, which was drawn up by representatives of the different faith communities, by the way, including representatives of humanism, and represented an agreement by all faiths to teach about other faiths in ways which respected other faiths and were agreed by them. There were a number of examples as we did that work of people being able to point to places where people had been taught completely wrongly about what other faiths actually were, what their belief systems were and what they did. And the purpose of our non-statutory framework was to try and reduce that and get a more accurate description into the way in which the issues were addressed in school. The positive common values of all faiths were emphasised, including opposition to the misrepresentation of faith by some of the sectarian groups I described earlier. I think there remain a large number of issues around the curriculum, and I hope that steadily in all schools and colleges there will be a higher quality of teaching about faith and better educated young people about the reality of all faiths and their beliefs and practice. And I think it's important too to increasingly marginalise those small numbers who want to teach religious education in a way which misleads and represents other faiths, and that still exists in this country. It's through the teaching of such a curriculum that understanding between communities can be enhanced and sectarianism reduced. And I hope that the curriculum will be enlarged by engagement with faith leaders of all denominations, which already happens in quite a widespread way through the excellent work of the sacres in between schools and local faith communities. And I think it's important to show young people the practice of faiths, for example, by those mosques, synagogues and churches which have held open days and encouraged school groups to visit them. As I say, that is happening now, increasingly so, but I think the more it happens, the better. Such a positive agenda should infuse debate about faith in schools. The current unease about faith schools is destructive and damaging, often based on ignorance about what's actually taught in faith schools. Faith schools of all denominations are rightly required to and do teach the national curriculum, though obviously with the development of academies that's a more qualified document than it was, but now generally including the non-statutory curriculum I mentioned. Inspectors check that's happening, and in general faith schools perform relatively well educationally, I believe because the ethos and commitment of the schools is generally good. New faith schools must be required to follow the same approach. There's some serious issues about that at the moment. The test which the state should apply for faith schools is whether they're educating well or not. The national criteria on admission should be fairly followed, and there are issues that still remain in that area. But I strongly believe it's time to put behind us the kind of rhetoric from some which suggests that faith schools tend to create communities like Beirut or the more bitterly divided parts of Belfast, as Richard Dawkins has argued with me in various public debates. Simply not true, and any debate should take place on a proper footing of understanding what actually happens. The right way to deal with the relatively small number of places where schools do tend in practice to be divided on the basis of faith through local action to promote interchange and understanding. I should say in this context that last year I co-authored with Professor Linda Woodhead from Lancaster University a pamphlet on this whole subject of the relation between religion and schools, 70 years after the 1944 Education Act, which established the current legal framework, which I'll be discussing further at an event here at UEA on June the 27th, in an event also supported by the Keswick Hall Trust. I've got a copy in my bag of the pamphlet that we produced. My final point, the sixth point, is that fundamentally we have to stop discussing faith behind the back of our hands in all the policy areas I've mentioned above. Lee was kind enough to mention the Westminster faith debates, which with Linda Woodhead we established and run over the last 3 or 4 years in London, where we've had debates about the place of faith in our national life. And what was so striking and indeed moving about the debates that we had was the number of people who came forward from politics, from government, from media, saying we're absolutely delighted to be able to discuss faith. We've thought it's an undiscussable question. You can't talk about it in our government office or in our political party, whatever it might be. I was absolutely knocked back by this response. And I'm absolutely convinced, more so as a result of those events, that we do need to ensure that the relationship between faith and our society is discussed openly and frankly, which involves, of course, a lot of really quite difficult questions, particularly in the area of education, community cohesion, social care, health, constitutional change. Faith has a significant part to play. Many of the ethical issues in modern social policy, for example, abortion, assisted dying, are ones which exercise atheists and agnostics as much as they exercise the faiths. And it's not, for example, true to say that on the question of assisted dying, a very controversial view, you've got people of various faiths on one side and people who are atheists and agnostics on the other. It's simply not a correct description of what's taking place, but it's how the discussion tends to take place. And we've got to openly discuss these ethical questions, difficult as they are, in a way which engages the whole breadth of opinion on these questions. It does no one any good to present these issues as battles between the faiths and the rest of society in the way I think they've often been presented. Faith has to be considered in its right place as these debates proceed as they will. And the role of faith needs to be considered on the basis of facts and not on the basis of inaccurate assertions. We need to build the foundations of understanding between communities and faiths in order to build a world in which the conflicts and tensions which beset us today can be set aside for a more stable future, harmonious and understanding. I do think events such as these Keswick Hall Lectures can help the whole society and the body politic to achieve a more balanced debate. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, I'm so glad that they are taking place on this basis. I'm proud to have been asked to participate in them, and I'm confident that we'll continue to act further to extend these debates as widely as we can to ensure we get the widest possible participation in the debates. Thank you for the chance to discuss this evening, and of course I'm very happy to take any questions or discussions that anybody would like to raise. I suppose I'd better get a pen, first of all, to make sure I can write down your names, and then take the questions in threes, if that's okay. Thanks very much. Who'd like to indicate? Gentleman in the middle there, with almost as much hair as I have.
From what you've said about strengthening...
Do you mind just giving your name, please, or organisation?
John, I'm a Quaker.
Okay, thank you.
From what you've said about strengthening faith communities through the work of the state, acceptable faith communities, would you say that Constantine benefited Christianity by becoming a state religion? And has the persecution of faith ever decreased faith rather than increasing it, as I would assert? And even in the USA, where faith is off the state agenda, it seems to be doing rather better than it is in our highly tolerant society.
You're taking me slightly beyond my knowledge and understanding in discussing precisely what Constantine did. But taking your general point, I would say, if you look at the United States at the moment, the idea that by excluding religion from the schools, from the Constitution of the United States, and saying it was entirely not religious, those who thought that somehow would exclude religion from the national life of America have been demonstrably shown to have been completely wrong in every respect. Certainly in relation to politics, but also in relation to many other areas. In the case of France, where, as I said in what I had to say, the history of the French Revolution, where the Church was one of the greatest states of France prior to the Revolution, but again, religion is supposed to be excluded from the national life of France. I was very struck. I was in France shortly before the last presidential election, and there was an interview with François Hollande, now the president of France, and he was asked what he thought the greatest problem that Nicolas Sarkozy, the sitting president, had in his election campaign. He said Sarkozy didn't understand laicism well enough. And I thought that was an extraordinary answer in an election, French presidential election campaign. But of course it was because Sarkozy had been trying to vilify not simply the fundamentalists, but the whole Islam community, and mosques wearing the veil and so on, which Hollande considered damaged Sarkozy's ability to lead the whole country. And so he drew that point out. Now, why do I say this? Because I think any idea that by persecuting, eliminating, bypassing faith, you can somehow drive it to the margins of society is, in my opinion, completely wrong. Now, your Constantine question is a different one, because it's, do you actually have to have a, quote, state religion in some sense in this or not? I don't think you do have to have a state religion, but you do have to have a state which respects that different religions exist and allows and encourages those religions to exist. And I think a state which tries to exclude religion, the extreme examples I gave in my lecture, Pol Pot, Stalin, and so on, at the end of the day, simply don't succeed. My wife's family comes from Estonia, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, and many of her relatives are Lutheran priests, some of whom had to flee to the forests in the early 1950s to stop, so they weren't arrested by the Soviet police. Some of them were in fact arrested and did go to Siberia, and some of them were killed before that. But the point was that the Lutheran Church was the vehicle for people to organise against the society which was irreligious in its character. I'm not sufficiently expert in the history of Poland, but Pope John Paul III, Cardinal Wojtyla, the Catholic Church in Poland played an important role in enabling a more democratic society to emerge there. Now, again, all of these historical circumstances are different. My only point is not to say one of them's right and that takes you in a certain direction, but it's to say any effort to exclude proper discussion of religion and faith in a society will not succeed. And it's better, therefore, to face that up front and have proper discussion about it rather than to try and avoid it and discuss it behind your hand. Other points? Yeah.
George Mills. I'm interested in your views on the relationship between faith or faiths and public politics. It can often seem, I think, that politicians rather resent it when faith leaders start expressing views which they deem to be either political or on social issues that they think are their preserve. I think you can get the same sort of reaction possibly from the media at times. Do you think that faiths have or should have a role in the public discussion of political attitudes and values?
I don't see why not. I don't see why anybody from a given faith shouldn't express a view about the matters of public controversy. I think the issue arises where it comes from the leader of a particular faith community who claims to be speaking on behalf of that community. So if you take, for example, the Catholic Church and abortion, where there's a lot of evidence that the majority of Catholics don't accept the teaching of the Church as expressed by the leaders, or more recently on gay marriage, or whatever it may be, then I think that's a problem, but that's a problem in terms of the representativity of the leadership of the various faiths in terms of what they say. Part of our Westminster faith debates, we had a very substantial, enormous poll of the country on these moral questions, which turned out that most of the key faith leaders were not expressing the views of their faiths. And so there's an issue that arises there. But I don't think that should lead the politicians to say, well, you can't say it. I don't see why the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Cardinal of Westminster, whoever, can't say whatever it is they want to say about the debates. I agree, you're right. There are some people who seem to resent that contribution to the debate. And there is a view that politics is over there and faith is over there. I just don't think that's where the world is today. I think politics and faith are interrelated in various ways, and debate around the issue seems to me entirely reasonable. Now the question, if anybody expects, as they enter a debate, not to be challenged in debate by people who take a different view, then they're unwise. And so if the Archbishop of Canterbury believes that in saying what he does about welfare benefits or whatever it might be. Somehow, because he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's above the political discussion. I don't think that's a wise view for him to have in those circumstances. But I think he's absolutely entitled to say, along with everybody else, this is my view about these issues as they come along. And it's a matter of judgment for him or her how he deals with that. Yes, there's a gentleman up there.
My name's Kevin. I'm a non-Trinitarian and also a fascist of love. But my question is, when you look at the Bible, obviously, touching what the gentleman said over there, that Jesus talked of Caesar and God. But when you go back to looking at schooling, I think the government have actually got just say this is what's going to happen. Don't allow it to be the debate, because we're running out of time, because we are facing a major war between Islam and the West. And I feel that schools need to start from the age of 5 and inform the children of the Torah, the Christian faith and Islam, that each teach that you're not allowed to marry out of your faith, or you've got to stay within your own faith. And that question needs to be put to the pupils from a young age, so that they can learn about love and then thus hopefully reduce violence in the world. And I think schools need to get that sorted out quickly, and the government must dictate and say this is what is going to happen, because we're going to be facing a major war in the near future.
I'm afraid I don't share the essential presumption of your question that we are walking into a war between Islam like that and the West like that. I simply don't think that's a correct way of characterizing the world. I don't think there is a unified Islam. For example, I think the Muslim community in Britain is quite different from the Muslim community in Jordan, for the sake of argument. It simply is, in terms of their beliefs and values. As I said in my lecture, there's a different question about some groups within Islam. ISIL is a very good example about how we contest that. But I don't myself think the way to contest it is just by attacking Islam throughout. This pamphlet that I mentioned in my lecture is about trying to ensure that in every school there is proper education. I agree it's urgent, about the nature of religions and beliefs and what they really are, and by the same token, what they are not. And I think part of that is also enabling children, young people, to help think for themselves and have a critical thinking approach to religion. And for my money, that involves discussing religions in a wide variety of different ways. So, for example, I support the recent government decision to say that if you're doing GCSE in religious studies, you should have to study 2 religions, not only one. And I think there's even a case of saying you should study more religions, even at that level. I've talked to head teachers of Jewish schools, Orthodox Jewish schools in London, who say that if that happens, they're not prepared to teach their children about anything other than Judaism, and so they won't allow them to go into the GCSE religious studies. I think that's a wrong attitude. I think one needs to get a broader understanding. Now, I may have misunderstood your question, but I think that simply taking one text and saying that is the basis on which children should be taught in every school is not the right way to go. I think one has to go down a different course of trying to encourage children to do things more widely. The, I would say, appalling Trojan horse dramas in Birmingham a couple of years ago were about one particular sect trying to take over 2 or 3 schools, not, by the way, faith schools, just ordinary community schools, and ensure that one particular version of religion was what was taught in that school and nothing else. I think that's completely unacceptable, and it's necessary to try and stamp that out. So I don't like the idea of saying that the way to prepare our children for the future conflicts that emerge is to set it up as Islam versus the West. I don't think that's a correct description of what needs to be done. I can tell from just looking at you that we don't agree about this, but it's fair enough to ask the question, and I'm giving you my basic answer to it. Okay. Okay, but that's one belief within a range of beliefs. Anyway, I think we've got the point. There's a woman here who wants to ask a question.
Hello, my name's Siobhan, and I work at a university. I was having a conversation with some of my colleagues the other day, and they worked in a languages department, and they seemed quite concerned about the fact that they seemed to be getting fewer students than they did, say, 10 years ago, and they said that that was a result of the curriculum, obviously.
Sorry, the what?
The curriculum, so primary and secondary school curriculum, specifically to do with GCSEs. I was wondering, it's kind of a two-pronged question, I'm sorry. The first question really is, what role do you think universities should be playing in this discussion? And the second one is, what role do you think language plays in the discussion as well, or in the problems that arise?
Well, universities have a very important role to play, and in my opinion, they should be places where faith is discussed, and that's why I said I welcome the Keswick Hall Lectures. It's very interesting. If you look at some of the great universities in this country, they were founded in opposition to the faiths of the time, University College London as a case in point. And they are increasingly ready to discuss these things. But I think, it would be fair to say that religion hasn't been a major aspect of the way that universities have operated for some time. And I think it would be beneficial if it were more openly discussed. Now, I'm not saying it should simply be following the dictates of a particular religion, a particular faith, or whatever. I think its impact on the wide set of issues which are there needs to be considered. As far as language is concerned, I don't think that, there's a lot of discussion about language, and the biggest failure in the UK education system, in my opinion, is the very poor level of language learning at primary school, which happens for a variety of different reasons. And there are also some problems at secondary school. It's a long and separate debate. But I must admit, I wouldn't have thought that was a central issue for thinking about religion in our society. If you mean language in a very special sense, i.e. the kind of words that are used to discuss these issues, I'd agree with you to an extent, but in the sense in which I think you meant it, of modern foreign languages, I wouldn't say it was such a key point. Okay, got one right on the edge, then the next, and then there.
Richard Capper, I'm a priest in the Church of England. I agree with your lecture and your request for tolerance throughout society. Tolerance between faiths, tolerance between those of faith and those not of faith. That seems, in fact, should be very appropriate. But don't we live in a much less tolerant society in terms of how politicians and media treat refugees, how they treat those on benefits, how they treat the poor? Aren't we living through a time of intolerance on all sorts of things that makes it very difficult to be tolerant over matters of faith?
I agree with everything in that question except the very last bit. We are living in an increasingly intolerant society, I think, and there are elements of our society which make tolerance very difficult. Some parts of politics, some parts of the media make it very, very difficult. But I still think we need to hold to the values of tolerance, which I think are absolutely at the core of the British democratic system, if I can put it like that. The only part of what you said I didn't agree with was the final link to talk about tolerance of religion and faith being linked to what went on before. There are elements of that, and the danger is that in a society where there's economic crisis, where globalization is transforming the whole way in which we look at the world in ways that our parents' generation had very little knowledge of, understanding of, comprehension of, it's very important to accept that religion is an important part of our life, an important part of the life of millions of our citizens, and it should be accepted as such and debated as such. And that's what certainly the reason why I work in this area at all, is I believe it's very important. It was driven from the time when I was Education Secretary and we had to deal with issues like RE in the curriculum, like the act of collective worship. When I was Home Secretary, when we were talking about community cohesion, we were talking about terrorism and so on. In all of which issues, faith is quite important, but the level of understanding in politics, in amongst opinion formers, of how faith actually operated and what it did, simply wasn't good enough. You know, as a Church of England priest, I'm sure, in what you see in your own parish, there's lots of education which is needed to ensure that people understand the way that faith actually is and what happens. And that's not a straightforward thing. But that means fighting against intolerance in a wide variety of different ways. Now, you can go through the particular cases you're talking about poverty, about refugees and so on, and it's worth doing that and having the discussion about what is the place of groups of people like that in our society and how does a society deal with it. What you can't do, immigration's a classic example, what you can't do, in my opinion, is simply say, we can't discuss why people feel concerned and threatened by migration, as they do, according to all polling. We have to try and really get beneath that. And is there an element where people genuinely are threatened by it? Is there an area where it's all just something which is invented? What's the truth of it? But it's my same point as I say about faith. Got to discuss these questions openly and get the framework of the discussion into the right place.
My name's David Huband. When Tony Blair sidestepped the question about whether he and George W. Bush prayed together, do you regard that as a wasted opportunity or just good political judgment?
What, to pray together or to sidestep the question?
He could have said more than just, he could have done more than just avoid the question, which is what he did.
Well, I suppose he could have done. Tony's attitude to faith was very complicated. As part of these Westminster faith debates, we had a very entertaining debate. We had something called the Westminster Faith Interviews, which was taking a fairly prominent person of faith and asking them what their views were. When I use the word faith generally, because we also had a very prominent humanist, questioned by a journalist who knew the area. And we had one of them with Delia Smith, as you possibly know, apart from being cook and owner of Norwich City Football Club, is also a very passionate and committed person of faith. And we asked her to be interviewed by Alistair Campbell. And we gave him a T-shirt when he came along saying, "We don't do God." And he told the story of Tony Blair not doing God and what had actually happened in that process. And fundamentally, Tony obviously had religious beliefs, deeply had religious beliefs, as most people who have religious beliefs. I'm sure they informed his life in the way he thought he was carrying out his responsibilities as a public servant. But he didn't think that the British people wanted to hear about it in that sense. He didn't think that people liked the idea that they're about religion being paraded by political leaders, because it actually goes back to the question that was asked earlier, because it tends to imply that you think that because you're a religious person, you have greater rights than anybody else in terms of what you say and think. So he generally tried to downplay his own religious beliefs significantly. He only joined the Catholic Church after he finished being Prime Minister, because there would have been issues about that, even in a quasi-constitutional way, ridiculous though it sounds. So I'm sure when he had that particular question, he didn't want either to be discourteous to George W. Bush or to get involved in a debate about why he was praying and what they did. And so he decided to duck the question rather than answer it directly. I'm sure that was what it's about. I have no idea if he did pray with George W. Bush. In a sense, I'd be surprised if he didn't, because all the time, you go to church services, and if you're a believer, as he is, you pray in those services with all kinds of people in different ways. The conclusion that people try and draw, which is that George W. Bush was driven in some sense by his faith, and that Tony Blair, quotes, driven by his faith, was somehow seduced into a course of action which was appropriate or inappropriate as a result of them praying together, which is the implication of when people ask the question, I just don't think is right. I don't think that described the relationship between them. Gentleman up there.
Christian, I work as a marketing executive. It's quite interesting how much of an emphasis you've placed on education, and I do agree that that's a very important factor in keeping people informed. But the fact is, once you're chucked out on the other end of the education system, there's nothing there to really guide those thoughts. You've got to actively want to keep yourself informed. There doesn't seem to be any sort of solution for that great mass of people who don't regularly attend a place of worship to actually stay informed about this. How are you going to encourage people to do that and make sure that we have that debate continuing beyond the age of 21 or 22?
It's a good question. As I said in my lecture, I'm not a theist myself. I've never been a member of any faith community. I've never been able myself to believe in the idea that there is a God in the sense in which it's widely used. But I do think it's an important subject. When I look back at myself, I think I form a set of views about the great, mainly Christian churches, which I'm aware of, by big things which were dominant. So, for example, the attitude of the Catholic Church to contraception is one which I found quite inexplicable from what I would consider to be my point of view. And despite all the other messages that the Catholic Church sends about its belief systems, that is a big rock. I'd say that the Church of England and its approach on women bishops and on civil partnerships, then grey marriage, in my opinion, has focused on some beliefs there, but it's become identified for large numbers of the people you're talking about, mature people, defined by those belief issues rather than by the wider set of values which the churches actually represent. So in my discussions as a non-believer with the leaderships of those churches, I say, don't you realise that there are, in my opinion, millions of people who are turning away from your churches who would be with you, but because of your stance on some of these questions, actually they simply can't go along with it. And I was reinforced in this view through doing these Westminster faith debates that quite a large number of serious people talked to me about their own beliefs as a result. And there are people who've been brought up Christians, they've done this, they've done that, but they simply couldn't accept the doctrine of the churches on some of these quotes, more and unquotes issues. Now, is it the case that, for the sake of argument, the women bishops issue, when it was there, it still is there for the Catholic Church, is such an important issue for those churches that it puts itself above the whole of the rest of the view? Our colleague a second ago mentioned attitude to refugees, attitude to people in poverty. These are very, very important values that he has just referred to in what he said. If for many people those values are reduced by comparison with these other issues, well, I would say it's simply a case that society has moved on, but the church hasn't moved with it. I think that's a problem. So my answer to your question, but I don't have the right to say this because I'm not a member of these churches, is try and get onto your main values, try and illustrate how your main values relate to the society today, and try and get off some of these areas where you're really out of sync, not only with popular opinion, but also with the members of your own church. The statistics on what Church of England members think about this set of issues, women bishops, gay marriage, and so on, compared to what the leaders say is the position, are very, very striking. A massive divergence that is there. So my view is get in touch with your own members and what they're thinking and try and reflect that, and try and focus on the big moral values questions where people are interested in listening to you, I think. But the message is confused because of fighting on other questions. I'll take one more, and then I think we have to close. Gentleman in the middle there. Yeah.
It's simply to do with the language and the semantics of it all, and we've all been using words like faith and belief, obviously, extensively in this conversation this evening. My name's Peter Nichols. I'm sorry, I describe myself as a follower of Jesus, if you like. And I just wonder whether there is a lack of honesty or a disingenuity about this, because if you're a person who doesn't believe in God, that's a belief. And we always use the word faith and belief only about the so-called faith communities, whereas politicians who are secularists are just as much believers, but in something different. And I wonder somehow if a way out of this whole issue is to change the language. I don't quite see how to do it, but we somehow have to be more honest about the fact that those who don't share a conventional religious belief, nevertheless it is a belief rather than something that in any scientific way could be proven.
It's interesting. I've been taken to task by saying I'm not a man of faith by friends who say, actually you are, your faith is the Labour Party. And I say that used to be the case until the election of our new leader. No, that's my faith still is the Labour. My faith still is the Labour Party, actually. But and it's your point is an entirely legitimate one. Everybody's got a set of faiths of different kinds, and to simply say a subset is of faith, which is religion, is faith, is not correct. Similarly, the Church of England is very, very exercised about the use of the word faith schools. I went to see the Bishop of Ely when I was to show him this report shortly before we publish it, who speaks for the Church of England on education at the moment. And he was very, very clear. The Church of England doesn't see their church schools as, quote, faith schools in that sense. And there is a worry that faith schools are being seen as increasingly mad and foolish parts of the education system, when in fact there are a very large number of schools, and many, many schools that are part of the Church of England schools, Catholic schools and so on, are in looking at a much wider version of beliefs in this area. Now, I would like to find a linguistic solution to the problem you describe, but I haven't done so, is all I can say. Now, if you offered one, I'm absolutely up for it. But I haven't found one, and I think it would be better. I think everybody in their own way has their own faith, which may or may not be a theistic faith. If it is a theistic faith, it's changing. My colleague I mentioned earlier, Professor Linda Woodhead, gave a lecture earlier this year at the British Academy, saying that for the first time, and she goes through the polls a lot, no belief is a majority of UK respondees given a choice of religions and so on, no belief. Now, what does no belief mean was her lecture about, because actually this covers a lot of people who do actually have theistic beliefs, but they don't want to be classified as Church of England for whatever reason, but they practice their beliefs in a much more flexible way, if I can put it like that. This is the debate we have to have, but I haven't got an answer to the question. Can I simply say, Lee, thank you very much for the evening, and I've enjoyed it very much, and I encourage the debate to continue.
Thank you very much indeed, Charles. It was a very thoughtful, very wide-ranging talk, and we've got a lot to sort of debate and to discuss over the coming days, I think, and some of the issues which were raised. As far as this is concerned, obviously we've come to the end of these series of 3 lectures. Charles will be giving another lecture, not within this series, but for Keswick Hall in June, as he's flagged up to you. But what we are interested in doing, when I say we, think of John Charmley, myself and Charles, is we are really very, very interested in reaching out to the local faith, if you'll forgive using that term, faith community or communities within this local area. Because religious literacy or faith literacy is a real problem within the way media portrays things, how politicians portray things, and how conversation goes at the grassroots level. And so we're really interested in finding out and working with people in terms of how we can communicate faith, religion, in a way that's accessible to our politicians, to our policymakers, and to those who orchestrate our news. There's a list outside. If you are interested in taking part in that debate and that talk, or know of your own faith leaders who would be interested in taking part in that debate, please leave your contact details, and we'll be very pleased to make contact with you. We see this as being an ongoing mission, if you like, in terms of trying to get faith literacy back on the public agenda. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate you being here. And once again, your appreciation for Charles. Thank you.